Director and Chief Curator here at Jane Addams Hull-House Museum. How many of you have been here before? Great. Welcome back. I hope that you had a chance to see our exhibition that's connected to this discussion. How many of you were able to see Claiming Space, Creative Grounds, and oh, good, okay. For those of you who haven't, there's still a chance. The museum is a tribute to Jane Addams and the social reformers and radicals who came to the near west side of Chicago in 1889 to create social change and work and live alongside their immigrant neighbors who were struggling with labor exploitation, racism, sexism, a lot of isms. And the way that they did that was to create a social settlement that was here in the neighborhood that was offering services for people, direct services, like health clinic, daycare, but also advocating for public policy, as well as lots of arts and cultural activities. This was a very animated space where each week up to 10,000 people were coming to use the services here. And there were about 13 buildings that were part of the social settlement. You are in one of two remaining historic buildings. And the museum where our exhibition is the second one. So we encourage you to come and see the exhibitions, especially Claiming Space, Creative Grounds, and Freedom Summer School, which is focusing on school closures in the West Side and featuring a collective called Creative Grounds as part of the show. We're two people today. Part of that collective are here, and one is on the panel. You'll hear from more, Paola Aguirre, and also Sara Pooley, who is sitting in the audience here. So we're very excited to have them and all of our powerful speakers today. We also just launched another very exciting exhibition that's focused on the West Side last Thursday, so I encourage you to come back. It's called Art and Soul. It's called The Best Side, the Art and Soul of Jackie Hetherington, who is one of the co-founders, along with his brother, of a really important experimental art center that was created in 1968 in the North Lawndale neighborhood. And on the 50th anniversary of the West Side Uprising last week on April 5th, we launched it. It was created in the same year of the uprising, only 7 months later, so we encourage you to come back. Why are we focusing on the West Side, you might ask? This is all part of a project that is ongoing that was originally funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities called Making the West Side Community Conversations on Neighborhood Change. And we are putting West Side history in conversation with change, all the change that we're experiencing in all of our neighborhoods on the West Side. We've been having almost monthly community conversations, and now we've been creating exhibitions that bring out that history more, and some of the stories that aren't told and need to be told. And the purpose is so that we can think about the present and understand our present and how we can make change in the present as best we can. So I'm going to hand it over to Ross Jordan, who's also a Hull-House staff member and was really essential in doing a lot of the legwork for this series. And this is, as I said, this is the third part of our series. So welcome, and here's Ross.
This conversation is really great in the context of a lot of political action happening around the country and here in Chicago. We're super happy to have Kalyn Belsha with us today, moderating our conversation. She covers education at the intersection of race and poverty for the Chicago Reporter, and previously covered education for Catalyst Chicago and the Aurora Beacon News. She also teaches journalism and digital media at Loyola University Chicago. Kalyn recently finished a year-long series about the aftermath of the 2013 school closures for the Chicago Reporter. And her first radio story about one family that dealt with a multi-school closures aired in February under Reveal, which is a project from the Center for Investigative Reporting. So I really encourage you to check that out. On our website, you'll find a list of links to some of the reporting that Kalyn's actually been doing, including that radio publication. You can find that on our website, and I'm sure you can find it on Chicago Reporter as well. All of our guest bios are in your program as well. And if you like this program, and this is our last of our three-part series, but if you find that you enjoy this conversation and you're wondering, why are we talking to youth about education, what they want to see? Well, you're in luck. On May 8th, we'll be hosting a conversation led by youth from Free Street Theater, which is one of the first racially integrated theaters in Chicago that opened up in the 70s. And we're working very closely with the youth who produce plays and programming there for the last year, producing programming here that's youth-led. So please come back on May 8th at 6 o'clock for that. This food is great, so we'll have great food here. So come for that and stay for an awesome conversation led by youth. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Kalyn.
Thanks so much, Russ. So as Russ mentioned, for the last about year and a half, my sole job pretty much has been reporting on closed schools in CPS. So much so that I think some people have referred to me as like that closed schools girl. So I've learned a lot from doing that reporting, and I'm going to share a little bit with you about some of what I think are important findings that came out of the work I've been doing. And I've written about, I think, 6 pieces, and I'm supposed to have another piece come out next week, top secret. And they've all been around repurposing closed schools and the history behind why the closings happened and kind of how that is impacting schools today, because it's certainly not over. As we saw very recently with NTA and with the schools in Inglewood, school closures are still very much present in our lives, and we expect that there could be many more. So my series looks first at kind of the history of segregation in the city and how that really impacted where schools closed. And so I tried to tell a much longer story about housing and how a lot of the communities that were most impacted were ones that had had schools built there to segregate students. I focused a lot on the West Side for that particular first opener story. And very quickly, as I started reporting my series, I was able to find that the way that we thought schools would be reused and the way that the process was laid out was not followed in like any way, shape, or form. So everything that public officials said would happen, the opposite happened, more or less. So I spent my time in this series kind of documenting the promises that were broken and how we could have done better as a city. The school series is actually called Empty Schools, Empty Promises, because there were so many things that were promised to communities that did not come to be. And so for this series, we actually got grant funding to fly me down to Kansas City, which is considered a model for repurposing closed schools. They closed over 30 schools at once. And obviously we closed 50 schools here, so it's not the same, but for that size of a city, it's very comparable. And they had other empty buildings in their pool that they also had to reuse. So I looked at how they had done that, and I was able to really compare how we had failed compared to how other cities had done it, and that model already existed. So I was able to say pretty confidently, you know, Chicago could have looked to these other cities, and we didn't do what was already a really good model. As we started to finally repurpose schools and sell them, which we were very slow to sell our schools here, I was able to see that there were a lot of issues with financing, and that because schools had sat for so long and we'd had such problems selling them, a lot of people who were stepping up to buy them wanted to build affordable housing. A lot of the buildings were in terrible disrepair, and they were all ending up competing against one another for tax incentives to try to repurpose the schools. And so the way that Chicago kind of set up these processes led to not very good repurposing policies. And when finally there were buyers stepping forward, a lot of them were having trouble getting financing. And so that was one of the pieces that I did in my series. Toward the end of the series, I tried to really focus on what we see the impact to have been on communities. And one of them has been the very bad destabilization where the closed schools are. And so I focused a lot on why families have left some of the communities where schools closed. And you can't say that there's a direct correlation, I found, but there is certainly a lot of families who would say school closures were either the last nail in the coffin for my family, or it was a contributing factor to me deciding to leave the city. And so me and my data editor at the Chicago Reporter got this really great data set from the state. We found 15,000 students who had left segregated black schools in Chicago and tracked to see where did these students go. Many of them had gone through school closures, not all of them. And a lot of them we found were ending up in very segregated schools that had very bad funding in Indiana, Northwest Indiana, and also in our south and west suburbs. And a lot of times when those students got there, they were experiencing the same exact problems that they had had when they lived in the communities here in Chicago. So we were able to kind of trace this cycle of problems that some of the students had gone through school closures, and they were watching more schools sometimes close where they moved. I profiled a family that moved to Gary, and they were going through school closures there too, and this family had gone through one in Austin. And so it's not just a problem that affects Chicago. Certainly it's a very critical issue here, but we're seeing school closures all over the country. Philadelphia has closed dozens of schools. Puerto Rico is about to close hundreds of schools. And so I think it's really important to think about our issue here in context of kind of a larger national way that we deal with schools with under-enrollment, and kind of the systems that people put in place to try to reuse those buildings often fail. Let me move my thing here. So we are now 5 years past that big closure that happened in 2013. We had a moratorium, and the district said, we're not going to close any more schools. So we're at the point now where that moratorium has just lifted. You could argue the moratorium wasn't actually in place that whole time because there were schools that closed, and I'll let my panelists talk a little bit more about what happened there. But we are now in a place where the mayor and the school board that he appoints can close more schools if they want. There are still 10 schools that are empty that were closed in 2013 that have absolutely no plan for reuse and no buyer at all. And many of the other schools that have been sold, if you were to look at the building, you would know nothing different. It looks like an empty building because there's been nothing that's happened there. In very few cases can you see anything happening to the building, whether that be construction or something outside with a sign that says it's going to be this. The lack of transparency has been a huge issue, and our panelists will talk more about that too. But we're starting to see some that will be used for housing, some that will reopen as schools, and some that will reopen as community centers. So I think it's really important that all of us as members of the public kind of keep paying attention to these buildings, some of which there is still an expectation that they belong to the public even though they've been sold to private hands, and some of them will remain in the city's hands, so it'll be still public property. So I think some of the big questions here that remain for me as someone who's been covering this for over a year are kind of, the criteria that's been used to close schools continues to change. And so we need to think really a lot about watching that criteria and whether or not it continues to shift and how that impacts our communities. There's actually some new legislation that's been proposed recently to try to fix some of the school closures process. So could there be new laws out there? We don't know. And also, we're under new leadership now. So obviously the mayor's the same, but there's a new CEO at CPS, and what she does and how she handles school closures will be very critical. She is a product of the system. She's got kids in the system. So certainly, what happens to children more directly impacts her. And so I think it'll be really interesting for all of us to watch and see under a new CEO leadership and the new people she's put in under her, what happens. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panelists to you. If each of you could just say your name, where you work, and just a little bit about yourself.
Good evening. My name is Paola Aguirre. I'm an architectural and urban designer. I have a urban design practice based in Pilsen, and I'm a part-time educator at the School of the Art Institute.
Hello, my name is Beatriz Ponce de Leon. I am the executive director of an organization called Generation All, and our focus is on revitalizing and strengthening our neighborhood public high schools. I was born and raised in Chicago. My parents are from Mexico, and they came with a really strong belief in education, but at the time, it was around Catholic schools, right? And so I didn't experience the public school system, but came to really understand how important it is for our democracy and for our city. And so I'm really committed to this work and excited to see so many people interested in it.
Hi, I'm Kate Gladson. I'm a staff attorney at the Legal Assistance Foundation. I represent kids who are in foster care in education matters across the city. For my first 2 years at LAF, I did a fellowship specifically serving students who were displaced or otherwise impacted by school actions. So students who were at the schools that closed or students that attended the schools that accepted students from closing schools. So a lot of my experience with this comes through my clients and through the cases that I worked on.
Thank you so much. So we're going to start with just a couple questions that I have for our panelists, and then we'll move into Q&A. So if you want to start thinking about questions that you have for the panelists, that would be great. We'll definitely have time for interacting with the audience. So this is a question I ask myself all the time because I'm always thinking about it. But I guess, what do you see as being the big legacy from the 2013 closures? How do you see them still impacting what happens in our city today? And what, for you, are the big kind of missed opportunities, things that could have gone better?
I guess I come from a design background. I come from architecture, from design. Our profession, our discipline doesn't necessarily engage very closely with this kind of issues, sadly. But I just, I become really interested. My background is in public service. As a young architect, I had the opportunity to work in government. So that part of public service became a very important part of my practice over the years, and that also influenced my interest in aspects that have to do with social infrastructure. When I started looking at the school's closure, I think we more or less started working on it at the same time, over a year and a half ago. For me, it was shocking, yes, seeing that a city that I admire and I came to know as Chicago, with all the beautiful buildings and the architecture, that was with amazing network of public spaces. How is it possible that a city like Chicago had this attitude towards its very own social infrastructure in the form of schools, of educational buildings? And from an urban design perspective and an urban planning perspective, where most of my practice is, I started thinking, what is the impact in the built environment? The effect of closed buildings, boarded buildings, has a catalytic effect, but it's negative, right? Once you start seeing the disinvestment or the underinvestment in our communities, there's a ripple effect that has to do with, that impacts health, that impacts other aspects of human or residents that I was really interested in looking at. So I think the legacy for me has been, I'm an optimist, and I tend to think of challenges and opportunities. And for me, the legacy has been, well, if we have this huge challenge of dealing with 50 or around 50 buildings in the city, which I started documenting and understanding what was the scale of that, it equals 3 million square feet of building space. For me, it's all about scale, understanding space around scale. Could this be an opportunity to rethink the role of social infrastructure in our city? As an architect and a designer, I deal with buildings that changed function over time. Like, buildings have cycles, but is there a better way to deal with the transformation of these assets, specifically with schools, because they have such a strategic location in our neighborhoods, are designed to be at the center of public life, are designed to be equidistant and accessible to everyone. They're usually surrounded by public infrastructure and public transportation. So how do we think about from the built environment perspective in regard to transforming this building? So for me, it was a question of how do we rethink the role of social infrastructure around urban planning. And the missed opportunity, in my practice, I work a lot with communities, connecting communities to design. I think in architecture, we've been doing a really good job isolating ourselves from connecting with communities. And from that perspective, I thought a lot about the process. The process was not necessarily the most conducive, but it also was not the most engaging. So could we value and invest equally in process as much as we care about the outcome? We all care about these buildings being repurposed, and they will. I really have I'm convinced that those buildings will be repurposed. But it's not necessarily the outcome that I'm looking forward to, more so like what is the process to get there. So I'll save a little story that I have. I've been working with one of the developers. This series of questions that I started having led me to have conversations with people like Kalyn, but also talking to developers. I want to know what is their interest in developing this new buildings or repurposing this building. So I'll save that story for the next round.
Keep it on the stand. Yeah. Well, the focus of Generation All in supporting neighborhood high schools is really with the long view for equity. And when you think about equity in education, it's not just equitable access to schools, but it's the outcomes. So how do we ensure that our public school system gives all students the same opportunities, but not just equal, but what they actually need in order to have very similar outcomes. So to be able to finish high school and be prepared for whatever comes next. Through the work that we did, we really thought about neighborhood high schools in particular as anchors in communities. And I mean, many of you, if any of you grew up in the suburbs, there's usually one big high school, everyone goes there, and that becomes kind of like a central place in a neighborhood or in a community. I think in Chicago, we've had that in some years at different eras around the city, but we've moved away from that with the system of school choice. And I say that all to preface that in the closing of those 2013 schools, we really have to look at the impact on the students. So closing a school, especially when it's a community institution, an elementary school in particular, when it has served maybe multiple generations of families, it's a traumatic experience. And as Kalyn was saying earlier, some students may be experiencing another closure somewhere else, or they were promised a place in a better school, but it really wasn't better. And I think that's what we need to really understand is what was the impact on the students? How was that traumatic experience really mitigated? What did we do to support those students? And do we know what actually happened to them? I know that the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research is getting ready to present some research that they did using a variety of methods, qualitative and quantitative. So hopefully it will give us more insight into the impact on those students and those families. But as we look at future closings and different changes, we have to keep in mind what the impact was on those kids and on their families. And then secondly, I would say that the other impact is what did we really learn from the process? Because it really was kind of a sham public process. Students and people, all of us in Chicago and then even nationally, we witnessed a series of community hearings in which people got to speak for 2 minutes, pour their heart out, try to save their school. There were tears, there were yelling, there were very rational arguments. And in the end, the district didn't really respond to that input. And so think about the lesson. You're an 11-year-old child and you see this happen, what is the lesson that you learned? Especially if you are of color and you're low income. And we have to really reckon with that. We have to understand in our city that had a big impact. And it probably in a negative way, but also in a positive way, because it led to people organizing around school closings and around supporting public schools. And it also led to young people maybe being inspired for that. But we can't take away the trauma of it as well. There's a lot of talk about trauma-informed teaching, about violence, prevention, and this process of closing 50 schools at one time and showing students and their families that their voice didn't matter that much, that's traumatic. So we have to keep that in mind. And then I would just say in terms of the missed opportunity is that it could have been an opportunity to really engage the people who are going to be impacted by those closures in coming up with a solution. So rather than saying, we're going to close your school, tell us why we should keep it open, and then we're not going to keep it open anyway, how do you engage people in a process where they have a say in what happens in their community and where they understand what's going on at their local school and in their neighborhood also impacts what's happening across town and vice versa, so that we have a better sense of our public schools, not just ward by ward and neighborhood by neighborhood, but really as part of a city ecosystem. And so I think that opportunity of genuine, meaningful public engagement and making decisions is something that we missed out on.
Okay,
So I kind of struggle to isolate this down into what do I perceive to be like the one outcome, the one impact, the one legacy. Turning first to students, I'm going to echo a lot of what Bea said. I think the impact on students was profound. It was highly disruptive to students in the city of Chicago who had their schools closed or who were attending schools that welcomed other students. I think for all students, so regardless of whether or not you have special education status, all students, research has shown, increased student mobility for all students after the initial displacement, meaning CPS closed your school. Even after that initial move to the new school, there was increased rates of student mobility. And in the communities that were impacted, there are already high rates of student mobility, which can have really negative impacts on overall achievement and just pose additional challenges. So I think that was kind of a common harm that a lot of students experienced. Also, I did a lot of work with students who do have special education services. We saw a lot of common issues across schools with IEPs. So if you are a student with a disability, you have an IEP, which sets out the services you are entitled to under law. We saw a lot of students who either were not evaluated when they should have been, who didn't have their IEPs followed at the new schools, who had their services inappropriately cut, a lot of student records being lost, just a lot of challenges that went with that process. So for students and families that were impacted, it was highly disruptive. Stepping back to more of the higher level school level, I think one of the biggest challenges were shouldered by the welcoming schools. If you took the transition plans from 2013 and lined them up across your desk, they basically said the same thing, except for the name of the school and the address of the school. So the supports that were going to each school were essentially identical when we know that schools have very different needs and serve different student populations. So it's hard to do a direct comparison between school performance before the closings and after the closings because CPS changed their performance policy the next year after the closings. So the year that the schools were closed, we had a 3-tier system. The next year, so fall 2014, CPS shifted to a 5-tier system. There were still schools that went from being a level 1 on the 3 level to a level 3 on a 5 level. So they went from the very top of a 3 level to the very bottom of a 5 level. Those schools are kind of the clear indicators of where there was a fall in performance after accepting a lot of students. But again, those schools, they had a lot put on them with not necessarily the supports that they need. So as far as missed opportunities, I think taking the time to really see what each school needed and what the students actually needed could have really put people in a different position afterwards. And then taking a step even further back to the community level, I think as Beeb noted, I mean, this was traumatic, this was distressing for the communities that were impacted, and as everyone has commented, the building, there are a lot of still empty buildings across the city. And listening to testimony from public meetings and hearings this year, especially in communities that are being impacted again. So students who are attending high school in Englewood may have very easily gone to an elementary school that was closed in Englewood. NTA also accepted a lot of students from the 2013 closings that are now going to be displaced again. Hearing their testimony, I think, really shines a light on the fact that their experience and the trauma that persists for them today.
And I do just want to point out that in 2013, when the Consortium on School Research did a larger report looking at some of the impacts, their first report, Beatriz mentioned they're working on another one, they found that I believe 80% of the students who were impacted were African American, and a very large number were also low income. So when we talk about the students who were impacted, they are largely Black and largely low income, and that was also true in the most recent round of closures at NTA and in Englewood. So something that has come up a lot when journalists talk to top people at CPS is they say they've learned a lot of lessons from 2013. They like to point out that the same person who was at the top in 2013 is no longer there. That was Barbara Byrd Bennett. She is now in federal prison, not for closing schools, but for stealing money. And so the person who's now at the top, Janice Jackson, she says that she wants to be a lot more compassionate about how she closes schools. That was something she told me when I interviewed her back back in November. She said, we're going to try to be a lot more fair. We're going to try to take into consideration communities' needs. We know that hasn't always happened in the past. But when we saw the most recent round of closures here, a lot of people did not feel like they'd seen some things changing. A lot of people felt like history was repeating itself. So for the panel, where do you see there have been improvements in how CPS closes schools or talks about which schools it may close? What hasn't improved since 2013? Where are some of the things that you just feel like it's kind of repeating? And I guess what will it take to actually see some improvement in this process?
It's me again. So the biggest improvement I think I could summarize since 2013 would be Jenner Ogden. The consolidation that's happening this year finally got approved. So Jenner is an elementary school in the Near North community that serves students who lived in the Cabrini Green Housing Project. They are neighbored by Ogden International, which is a K-12, so they have an elementary school and a high school. Ogden basically makes a Pac-Man-like shape around Jenner by their boundaries. And those school communities had very different needs, but identified that they could work together to solve those problems. So Jenner was under-enrolled by CPS's standards, so it didn't have as many students as it should have in its school building. Ogden, on the other hand, was overcrowded. So those schools came together, the leadership, the administration, the staff, the parents, the community, engaged in a 2-year-long process to decide that they would come together and consolidate. They engaged the work of 2 outside consultants. There was extensive transition planning. They had a lot of really hard conversations, and that action, I think, is an improvement and a step in the right direction for making these decisions in an equitable way. That being said, there are still a lot of things that have not improved. I think, as Kalyn mentioned earlier, the racial bias that we're seeing, the same communities continue to be impacted year after year with these types of actions. Again, it was, I think, UChicago reported 88% of students who were impacted in 2013 were African American. Again, this year, NTA is nearly 80% African American. All of the high schools in Englewood are over 90% African American. We're seeing the same groups be burdened by these decisions, and I think that's something we need to look at very seriously. Also, transparency. Kalyn mentioned earlier, there were closings that happened during the 5-year moratorium. Montefiore was a special education school that basically CPS did not assign any students to that school in 2015. And sorry, it's going to be a little complicated. So they didn't assign any students there in the beginning of the fall. In October, they said, we will close schools this year if you don't have any students at them. And then in December, they said, we would like to close Montefiore. And then in January, they voted and did so, or in February. So there were closings that happened. Obviously, situations like that are concerning when it comes to transparency. And again, a lot of these decisions, what I've heard in working with people before meetings and public hearings, it feels like these decisions are made when the announcement is, or when the proposal is announced. And I think that that feeling of this being a done deal before the process has really gotten going is challenging. And again, just to kind of repeat what I said before, transition planning is essential, is so important. I think there are still issues with how we're assessing the needs of the communities that are being impacted and what is being put in place to make sure that the harm and the disruption to impacted students is mitigated. I'm going to pass to you. Sure. Sorry.
I'd like to kind of piggyback off of what you just shared. Definitely, though, I feel like CPS has made some adjustments to their community engagement process. They have an office called FACE, Family and Community Engagement. Now it's called FACE 2 because they've tweaked it a little bit. And in hearing about the proposed school closings and the consolidations this year, they talked about the new CEO, Janice Jackson, visiting at different schools and in different networks and having meetings with the school communities there. But it was very kind of under the radar, so if you didn't know that that was happening, or you didn't hear about it, you wouldn't have known, right? So it wasn't a very public process. I'm not sure what it was actually, how they organized these meetings, but I know that she and some of her staff did go out and talk to different communities and get some feedback. I think that goes to the transparency issue. So these aren't community meetings that are announced and shared widely so that people who are concerned about them can come and participate. They're very closed, and they seem to be, you know, almost by invitation only, although I don't know exactly how they invited people. I think there's a small step in the direction of a different type of community engagement, but it hasn't really happened in a wider way. And there are three things that happened this year that would point to that. So one is CPS announced the new common enrollment application for high school, Go CPS. How many of you have heard of Go CPS or used the system this year? So, you know, pretty much if you want to go to a selective enrollment high school, you still follow the same path of taking a test, and the same measures count for winning a spot in one of these schools. But for other high school programs, this was an attempt to put everything on one website and make it easier for families. So on the surface, it sounds great, but it also is a very effective tool at further stratifying how we sort our students across the district. Because if you were a low scoring child and you go on to Go CPS, you're automatically not allowed to select certain programs, not even the selective programs, but just every school has some criteria for different things, and so some programs would be shaded out and you couldn't even pick them. But students were directed to choose 20 schools, and then there's this magical algorithm that we haven't seen. We don't know what it is. People have asked to know what's in the algorithm and to figure out how they're matching students. That one gives you just one choice. So not too long ago, I think right at the end of March, students got that one match, and then if they were fortunate and got into a selective school, they got that match as well. That process was kind of just pushed through CPS. There was no public hearing on Go CPS. There were no major announcements about it coming up. It was proposed at a meeting and it was passed. Like, that was it. So there were parents, we've been doing some research on it, and other community groups have been organizing around it. We went to the district and went to the board meeting and asked for at least one more month to take a closer look at Go CPS. There was no turning back. So when we talk about public engagement and transparency, Go CPS is going to have a really big impact on where students end up, on enrollment in certain schools, and also just down the line on the outcomes for students. And yet there's no engagement or transparency around it. The second is the whole Englewood High School, the closing of those schools and the opening of a new school. That idea just sort of popped up, and then it was attributed to a community group, and then there's debate about who's on that community group, and is it really what the community wants? So again, there's sort of a perception that CPS is doing a better job at community engagement, but it's not really a very robust, meaningful, or transparent process. And the third, I would say, what you've mentioned several times already, is NTA, closing NTA in order to open a new South Loop High School. So CPS didn't call that a closure. They called it a, what was it? A reassignment, and therefore different rules applied to it. So that goes to two other things related to this process. Is one, the school actions guidelines, they change every year. So the CPS will publish them and be open for comment. You can read them and submit your comments. Many of us did, but those comments aren't necessarily taken into consideration, and they change all the time. So communities and schools can't even fully, organize to understand what's going on. And the second is that we haven't had an education master facilities plan for CPS that has been distributed widely and that people have a chance to participate in. So there is state law that requires districts to have a plan for where they're going to invest in buildings or do different things to the facilities, and yet it's kind of a mystery. So in terms of thinking about, has CPS improved its process? I think on a superficial level they're attempting to, but when you look really deeply at the policy still in place and at the level of engagement, it's really not a big change.
I moved the mic a lot, so I'm just going to leave it on the table. No, I think that was a great segue. I want to talk about the idea of investment and innovation, because I think we invest in things that we care about. And when we're not investing in process, I really like the example of consolidation that you mentioned, because it invested heavily in the process. I mean, hiring consultants and investing time, it's financial investment, but also time investment and energy investment. So I think when we value that, that's the outcome tend to be much more digestible, and the engagement is much more meaningful. So I think that has been something that we are not yet ready to do as a city, to invest in processes. I think there are other, I like to think, or I like to see where, or try to assess where the improvement has been made by zooming out, both in terms of the map of the city, but also zooming out in a timeline. When you think of a city like Chicago investing for over decades in their charter school system as opposed to the public school system, so you start to understanding where the priority of investment has been made in terms of educational facilities, but also operational aspects. So I don't think there's it's an issue of transparency, but also of priority, where the priorities are in terms of where to invest first, or who gets access to that investment first. In this case, obviously, if we go, several reports have been published about the investment that has had the priority have been charter schools. So if we didn't see coming as a city the closings of schools, I think we weren't looking closely to that data and those numbers. So I think we still have work to do in terms of allocating priorities and having a real say in those priorities. The other thing I wanted to mention, and it's not directly related, but I think Kalyn and I also wrote this piece about looking more holistically from a lens of equity, how the city of Chicago could have done a better job. We're always looking for, okay, we're learning, but can you do a better job? And I think city can be very innovative when it really wants to. The best example I can bring up about that is last year, 2016, there was a call that was requesting proposals to bring together, I don't know if this has happened, I'm new to Chicago, but I don't know if this has happened in the past, to bring CHH, Chicago Housing Authority, and CPS, Chicago Public Schools, together to develop a mixed development Chicago Public Libraries. Chicago Public Libraries and Chicago Housing Authority to bring together a development of 30 plus housing units and a library facility together, two agencies working in collaboration, bringing their resources, bringing their expertise, bringing their networks to provide to the city new amenities and a public affordable housing. So I keep thinking, whoa, there's innovation there. There's collaboration. Can that be done also in this kind of stock of buildings? Can we think about how CPS doesn't have to solve the problem alone as an agency? I think a lot of the burden has been put, for a problem of this scale, unprecedented scale, has been put into one agency. And I don't think one agency has the answer, nor the resources, nor the expertise, or the capacity. I also think, some of this engagement successes are more feasible in communities that have a stronger ecosystem of civic organizations. Communities like Inglewood, they're still rebuilding their capacity of agency and advocacy. I mean, the wonderful job that RAGE, Resident Association for Greater Inglewood, and Teamwork Inglewood are doing is relatively recent, although their voices are really being heard. So I think there's communities are still rebuilding their agency capacity, and I think just partnering with them closer, or taking closer attention to what are they doing, their local efforts, their grassroots efforts, it's something to consider in the areas of improvement. I will call it areas of improvement. I haven't seen any improvements yet, but I think there are areas of improvement that are really latent
and in many cases are low-hanging fruit. It's cultivating those relationships, but also being more strategic in like where to invest, where to be more innovative, and where to rebuild those conversations and relationships with the community with the capacities that these communities are trying to rebuild.
So Beatriz, you mentioned Go CPS being a system relatively new that you're kind of keeping your eye on because there's a possibility to stratify students. What else are you all keeping your eye on, because there is some fear that a current practice or policy or system that's in place right now could lead to further enrollment declines, which has been something that's been a criteria for school closings in the past, isn't only the only criteria that's been used. And so things that you're watching for that could lead to more school closures or to schools that are vacant not being repurposed. Kind of what do you have your eyes on?
I feel like I sound a little redundant, but I think I'm going to say them again. Go CPS is really critical. Like this year, we will know if students didn't choose a certain school. Let's say the school's already challenged and struggling with enrollment, maybe with outcomes and performance. Then next year, if their enrollment drops even more because we have per pupil funding, they'll have less money, they'll be able to offer even fewer courses, and then maybe the following year it'll be closed. It'll be a situation where CPS says, no one's picking that school, so we need to close it. And if we don't pay attention to that, we will be making, putting our vulnerable communities even at more risk. You can, instead of saying, well, the school isn't being picked, let's get rid of it, we can say, that school plays a really important role in this neighborhood. If we close it and we have this big empty building, it will just contribute to the cycle of disinvestment. So why don't we instead embrace that school and figure out a way to repurpose it, kind of in the way that you were commenting on. And you're right, let's not work just with the school system. School improvement and neighborhood improvement should go hand in hand, because you can put a bunch of money into a school, but if you do nothing around the community to make that community stronger, when the money dries out for the school, guess what? It's the same situation. Or the reverse, you could put money into a neighborhood and ignore that there's a school there, and then maybe just gentrify the neighborhood and eventually move everyone out of the school. So if we look at school improvement and neighborhood improvement together, we could be more effective. The other policy or issue that I would look at right now is the elected school board. So there are proposals, we passed a bill in Springfield that hasn't been gone into effect, hasn't been signed. It might not make it through, but if we don't have an elected school board, then our school board in Chicago, which is the only one in the state of Illinois, that's correct, that is not elected, it's appointed by the mayor, then it will always be a rubber stamp board. Because you can look at the history of the CPS board, and generally everybody votes yes for whatever is being proposed. There have been a few outliers, but it's almost always a yes. And so until we have an elected school board, we won't really have representation on that board of the communities and the people that are attending our schools. Many of the board members aren't even they have no stake in the school system. They have no children in the school system. They didn't go through the school system. They're not bad people. I'm sure they have good intentions, and some of them have done some good work in their careers, but it's not an elected school board. So that's something that we're keeping an eye on. And then the Education Master Facility Plan. CPS has to present an updated plan. I believe it's in October. They can submit something that's just a very kind of updated thing, or they can go through a process in which they really engage people in creating this plan. And why is this important? You might have heard recently, like, Wells High School got a soccer field. Kelly High School a few years back got a soccer field. Like these things seem arbitrary. Like, which school advocated strongest for the soccer field? Which alderman had the most pull to get that soccer field? There's just different things, and it doesn't seem to have any real plan for where we are putting our facilities money. At the same time, you hear of schools that have not just broken water fountains, but actually falling tiles and lots of facilities problems, and they never get taken care of. So in order to have a, and then we hear of these additions that are being added to buildings. I think Taft High School is a good example of something that hasn't been fixed, kind of like the Jenner Ogden. Taft is a really over-solicited high school. They have a great IB program. They have a middle school program. It's a neighborhood school, but it has these special programs that people want to go to. And it's also on the northwest side, so it's a little bit out of the way. Steinmetz is not that far away. Steinmetz is dealing with under-enrollment, and Taft is dealing with over-enrollment. And rather than redraw the boundaries and perhaps invest some money into making Steinmetz a better facility, Taft is getting an addition. That makes no sense. So we don't have a very public, maybe there's a plan at CPS or in the mayor's office that we're not aware of, but there's no process for really understanding what that master's facilities plan does include and having people participate in helping to make those decisions.
I agree completely on the Educational Master Facilities Plan. It's supposed to be a long-term plan, 10-year plan that has obviously long-term planning in mind for the entire district. These things don't happen in a vacuum, and I know when we get to the school action process, we're obviously looking at what is the proposal right now, but the EFMP is an opportunity to kind of take a step back and look at the big picture of what the district, where investments are being made and where needs are or are not being met. And then circling back to something you mentioned earlier, the guidelines do change every year. So when we think about the policies that are in place, the Illinois Illinois School Code actually sets forth provisions for how this whole process works. CPS has to announce its guidelines every year by October 1st. Those are subject to public comment for 21 days, and then we go through the meetings and the public hearings. Those comments can be different and are frequently different every year. So LAF has worked with other legal aid organizations to make public comments together on those guidelines. Some of the things that we have expressed concern about in the past were that we wanted CPS to look at things through a race equity lens and to assess the race equity impact of any proposed action. We also had concerns about transition planning, as I mentioned earlier, about making sure that it's unique to the school that's going to be impacted, and also maybe to address repurposing as well, since we now know from 2013 that repurposing the buildings has been really challenging. So is there a plan in mind for what we're going to do with buildings that are impacted? We also had concerns this year with the provision that allowed basically anyone to request a proposal for any school, depending on how you read it. So we expressed concern about how a provision that was phrased so broadly, so you could request a proposal for certain types of school actions, which are closings, phase out, boundary change, basically any type of restructuring except a boundary change. You could, a community member, which was not defined by the guidelines, could request a proposal for a school. So you didn't necessarily have to have a connection to that school to request it. We had just expressed concern about it should be people who are impacted most by the decisions that would be putting forth those ideas. Again, these are just examples of things that we publicly commented on, but everyone has that opportunity every year in October. Also, the public meetings and public hearings, I agree, it is frustrating. There's limited time to share input and thoughts and feelings about proposals, but those are structured into the law and are required every year. And this is a hard issue to kind of jump in on in a one-time kind of way. So staying aware of policies around this issue year to year, I think is really important. And kind of how Bea mentioned earlier, a lot of CPS's policies are overlapping, intertwined, and student-based budgeting also informs transition planning, also informs utilization. All of the things, all of the policies tend to run into one another in certain ways. So it's a challenging thing to jump in on, but once you're in, staying engaged, staying aware of recent developments can make it a little bit more feasible.
Yeah, I agree. I think, once you know about it, and I think that was the case for me, once you know about the issue, you just can't stay away from it. You feel like you have that responsibility to, I don't have any kids, or I wouldn't have any reason to be paying attention to this other than I care about the built environment and neighborhood's health. But I think once you know about it and communicating the issue in an effective manner becomes part of the task. And raising awareness constantly by multiple means and engaging others in feeling that they have that agency in advocating even though they're not directly impacted. I think we're all impacted, but some of us are not directly impacted by those policies. So I would say just for me, there has to be a serious adjustment in policy about representation and accountability. The 2013 closings had a plan. There was a report. There was a plan that was released, but there was no accountability to that strategy. So there was no oversight, no accountability, no mechanisms for representation. So the result was obviously no one's monitoring, no one's watching. So we'll just put a PDF somewhere there in the website, and if anyone wants to know, there might be a downloadable version there. But it's not, again, it's about investing in the resources that allows us to move forward. And if we're not making positions, these cannot be volunteering positions. Someone that cares and needs to be making accountable the city for these processes, they cannot be volunteering positions. Or parents that have to deal with this burden after work, about going to public meetings. It has to be a serious oversight. So I think the representation aspect is very important in terms of policies, but also the accountability. I would say also the integration and alignment of investments. Like, public agencies are in silos, and it's very frustrating to see some of them have resources, some of them have not, but they're all doing, or they have an impact in the footprint of the city. The more that they align, the more they look at where investment and disinvestment is being balanced or unbalanced, the better decisions can be made holistically. Again, it's not about one agency having the capacity to do all the change that is needed in the city, but the idea of bringing alignment of investments and integration of investments.
So I'm going to get to the last question I have for the panel, and then I'm going to move to many of your very wonderful questions that I've got here in my hands. So we've talked a lot about the lack of transparency, how completely opaque the process is for closing schools and repurposing schools in CPS. The criteria changes every year. It's very difficult to jump in if you're new to the topic. So what would be your suggestions for people who want to have their voices heard, who want to better understand the decision-making process? What should you do?
I feel like we've covered some of that, but I would say pay attention. So go to the CPS board meetings or follow them on Twitter. Kalyn is one of the best live tweeters, and there's others, WBZ Education. We live tweet sometimes, raise your hand. But you can really follow those board meetings every month and get a sense of what is up for a vote and what are people saying about it. If you are interested in your own neighborhood schools, they have local school council meetings, depending on the community. You can participate in those. They're all public meetings, but some of them are more lively than others. But it's a good way to understand what is happening at your school immediately. There are a lot of education advocacy organizations that are doing the work of keeping an eye on all these things, and you can connect with one of them. Generation All is one, Raise Your Hand is another. There's neighborhood groups like Brighton Park Neighborhood Council, Logan Square Neighborhood Association. We all have sort of this lens of wanting to protect and improve public education and being aware and kind of focused on the policy, but also on things that make a school community stronger. So there are definitely ways for people to stay connected to that. And I think in Chicago, we're really fortunate to have great education reporting. So really just following some of our journalists, and Lauren Fitzpatrick at the Sun-Times, BZ just hired 2 new people, but Sarah Karp and Kalyn, Juan Perez at the Chicago Tribune. They do some really nice in-depth reporting, and you can always kind of see what's going on there. And then if you want to get more active, I would say run for a local school council, and you can be part of that decision making, and hold your elected officials accountable, because at the end of the day, and that's both statewide in terms of school funding and the elected school board, but also in Chicago locally. The mayor really oversees the whole school system, appoints its leaders, and appoints its board. So if you want to have a say in public schools, we need to hold the mayor, whoever it is, responsible and accountable for what they do with our schools.
I would definitely agree on the staying engaged. I think the more you can be aware and participate in the process before there's a school that you're concerned about at risk, the better. The more you know about how the process works and what the guidelines are. Again, I think there are little things like having the guidelines on a more visible part of CPS's website. Right now, they're kind of scurried away on, you have to climb through a couple different windows, or accepting public comment through ways other than email. Sometimes for our clients, they may not have access to email, so being able to submit in writing is important. Again, community engagement in a long-term way, in a meaningful way, is really important. I'm pretty much had everything, not everything, your comments are unique, but yeah, a lot of just trying to understand from what the law requires and what local policy is, because it does change a lot, and there are amazing groups that are already doing a lot of important work to make sure that the rest of us know what's going on and what's in the works with CPS.
Yeah, I mean, I concur with that. It's awareness, like self-awareness, but bring the awareness to others. I think the more we know, the more, I think that was something that Sara and I were struggling with. We have access to all this information now. We found it. We found the information about those schools. Now what do we do with it? So we just, share it and put it in ways that it's accessible and clear, and everyone who sees understand the urgency. I think it's a message of urgency that it's really driving a lot of the efforts that I do. So I wanted to share a 3-minute video that I some of the action that I took. Again, this is already a closed school, but talk to the developers. Like they bought a property, but they're still accountable because they're part of a former public amenity. So the fact that they are new owners doesn't mean that we cannot talk to them. So we were really fortunate to establish a relationship with, go up? Yeah, that's the short one. Establish a relationship with a developer of one of the schools. In Bronzeville at Overton on 49th and Michigan, Indiana and Michigan. So we did this program to bring people inside the building that it was closed. This is one of the closed schools.
How can a closed school become a living, breathing, vital part of a community? Opening Closings has a number of different groups coming together.
JAHHM, which is an international organization dedicated to preservation. CAPE, which is working with young people and communities and education. And then with Borderless, kind of orchestrating this all to draw attention to kind of the history of these buildings and their possibilities.
It is a story of partnerships. We are all partnering up to produce a dialogue around the school closures and how we can be hopeful to reimagine and repurpose a beautiful building like this, a modernist building, to continue to serve future community.
Addressing a challenge of this unprecedented scale, it's not possible by only one organization, one public agency. There has to be several on the table, many brains, many hands contributing to how a better process can we make for this school repurposing. Can we come together as a collective and open the school to others to see what is possible to do in terms of temporary activation leading towards the reopening eventually of the building.
We are working to connect the community as well as broader design and architecture advocates to come down to Anthony Overton, which is an amazingly designed 1963 Perkins and Will building here in Bronzeville, and check out what this school means, not only for this community, but what it means for architecture and our interaction with the built environment.
In this school are projects by high school students. The Williams Prep students were working with their art teacher, Phil Cotton, and Cape teaching artist, Margie Stover, to explore questions about what is school and how can a closed school become, again, a kind of living, breathing, vital part of a community.
I think it's super tangible. People actually entering into a school and just seeing emptiness or non-activity is really powerful.
So what you see in the background, it's a neighborhood map of Chicago that it's identifying what the different schools that close are, but also what's their status. The map is showcasing what school buildings were repurposed immediately, what buildings have been sold, and what buildings are still for sale. Obviously, geography has everything to do with that.
The community loves this project. We're asking them, what skill set do you have, because we want you to work in the community. The community has adopted this as their project.
This is a way in which students can see how they can develop their own businesses, how they can influence their own communities, and how they can help neighborhoods grow. And by doing that, they're helping the city to grow. I want students to see that that can happen all across the city, and it can happen in their neighborhoods, and they can be a part of that.
It gives me the opportunity to really experience like how ideas can really turn into reality.
So this project really gets at the heart of what we're trying to do for the biennial as a platform.
We're looking forward to this truly being a great example of a community project. How Chicago can come together when we're focused on something, because what happens in one neighborhood really does impact all 77 neighborhoods and the surrounding suburbs as well.
And so we did that. It was a lot of effort. It's kind of summarized there, but it's a way of agency, and it's a way to just bring in awareness and visibility to this.
I just want to piggyback on that, because that's really exciting, and it would be even more exciting if we could do that with schools before they close. So if a school is under-enrolled and you want to really make it an anchor of a community, imagine having a process like that in which you could use part of the building, for a small business or a makerspace or a library. But we have to do that before we close the schools. It's a possibility.
And it's about innovation, like thinking beyond the box, right? Mm-hmm.
Great. So I'm going to get to the first audience question here, and I love this one. How can students build their voices to halt school closings? And the example cited here is Lynn Bloom. Even though Lynn Bloom became a selective enrollment school, there was apparently still a lot of voices that were raised there. And recently we've seen a ton of student voice coming together around school closings. So where do you see kind of the room for student voice, and how do they keep building that voice?
There is a ton of student activism and student voice in Chicago that has really always been there, but I think with this process of schools and the budget crisis a couple years ago, we saw students really get involved. And one of the important pieces is that they need adult allies and organizations that support what they do. Our schools have committees called Student Voice Committees. CPS supports that, their Office of Civics Education, and then also MICVA, which is kind of known around the city for supporting young people and understanding how to be civically engaged. So we've seen young people come out through those traditions. And then we also see students come together around more grassroots organizing, so community-based organizations that do organizing, that talk and teach about power, and they really let young people take the lead and are there to support them. I think Chicago, if any of you saw the news, you saw people, especially around NTA, these amazing 7th and 8th graders speaking up, and even younger. And we've seen high school students come together and really speak up. And clearly, recently with the Florida situation, we saw young people just come together and speak up. I would say that there's support for students to advocate, but we really need to listen. So that's the difference. Like, we have a lot of opportunities and organizations that are supporting young people, and there's no shortage of young people who want to come together and really voice what they believe in. But we, as the adults and people in policymaking decisions or positions and organizations, need to be better at listening and integrating them into crafting those solutions that we need for our schools and for our city.
I would agree with the listening. Some of the most powerful testimony at any of these meetings, at any of the hearings, are the students who can show you the concrete harms that are at stake. And also seeing students support one another has been really powerful. Like seeing students talk through like, oh, did you prepare your comments? Like, what do you have in yours? I have this in mine. Like seeing that at play this year, and it has been in the past as well, but I think what students bring to the process is indispensable and is definitely, anytime I'm looking at a hearing record or a transcript from a public meeting, those statements are always compelling and just a really essential, important part of this whole process.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the areas of expertise that we can lend as adults is organizing platforms for them. I mean, they are eager, they have the energy, and they have the capacity. They're learning how to voice their opinions, but I think if as adults we build those platforms for them, they take over immediately. Mm-hmm. So I think it's supporting in that way.
This is a question for Kate. Could you talk more about the effects on the receiving schools, aka welcoming schools, post the 2013 closure, some of the things you saw with your clients?
I think that's still kind of, hopefully UChicago new report gets at that a little bit more directly. So again, performance was difficult to do a one-to-one. The schools that fell dramatically, so from top to bottom, I think that was clear. It also got a little bit muddier because the CEO at the time stepped in and said, for certain schools, if you fell from a level 1 to a level 3, she preserved your status for the following year. So it makes it a little trickier. But I think there were resources that were promised. There were supports that were promised, but maybe not necessarily, again, tailored to the communities. So what exactly happened to each receiving school and how they fared kind of varied. It has, I mean, now that this is happening nationwide, there is more research coming out from other school districts about kind of the impacts on receiving schools. It has been somewhat mixed, but I think in a lot of ways they are seeing that those communities, I mean, obviously it's disruptive to have an inflow of students. Sorry, and this is kind of a tangent, just to segue. But there were also schools that were not designated as receiving schools that accepted a large number of students in fall 2013 that may not, I would hope, would fall within the research someday, but those schools weren't promised resources but still accepted a large number of students. So in 2015, UChicago did a study that found around 66% of students landed at their designated receiving school. The other students did not. When students transition to other schools, they need to go to a significantly higher performing school in order to have a chance at benefiting from that from the whole process, so from being disrupted. Again, sorry, got off on a tangent, but receiving schools, the results have been largely mixed. The schools that I would be concerned about too are also schools that receive a lot of schools, but not necessarily the designated and dedicated support.
And one thing I've seen as a reporter is that enrollment has gone down at a lot of the designated welcoming schools. So there's a lot of fears about the schools that we put this big burden on. Are they also possibly at risk of closure in the future because of that unsettling that happened to them?
Sorry, and then when your enrollment goes down, your budget goes down. Right. So there were schools that in I can hold it again. Thanks. So in when we switched to special ed student-based budgeting as well. So basically the impact of having your student population go down obviously impacts your bottom line on budget, but there were several receiving schools that got really hit hard as far as performance goes, and then their enrollment went down, and they also, again, it's a huge blow to your budget and your ability to support students. You were going to say something.
I think this is a nice segue into the next question. It's, do you think changing the way CPS funds schools, something to more like an evidence-based model, which is what our state just switched to, where larger amounts of money follow students based on their characteristics. For instance, if you are a low-income child, someone with an IEP, if you're an English language learner, you're supposed to get more money now. So if we did that in CPS, could we achieve a more equitable education? And I think the bigger question here is there any chance CPS would change what's going on with school funding?
I'll start with that one. I think we didn't always have school-based budgeting, and that is something that came with Barbara Byrd Bennett. It's considered a way to be more efficient and to give principals more autonomy for using the funds the way they want. But it's kind of a false choice because there's not enough funding. So rather than just giving principals like the autonomy to make decisions, they have to choose between really difficult things. So they don't have enough money to hire the teachers that they want, or the counselors, or the social worker, or whatever the other positions are, and they often have to make some tough choices. I think I heard recently that CPS was tweaking the student-based budgeting formula, and it is weighted slightly for special ed, for poverty, and for bilingual ed, but those dollars weren't really following the students. So a school might get money because they had a certain percent of kids in bilingual ed, or a certain percent with special education designation, but it wasn't guaranteed that the principal would then use it to buy the positions to provide those services. And again, that was another level of like accountability. There's so much room for things to go wrong, and for the services that children should have to not really be provided. It would be really incredible for CPS to move beyond student-based budgeting and to look more at how we do evidence-based budgeting. So we know what works in schools. There really is a lot of research about the kinds of things that make a difference in schools. And rather than make principals kind of choose between really difficult things in terms of what to cut and what to keep, if we could provide funding that was more holistic and that provided what students needed. There are Ontario, just to the north of us in Canada, not that far away. It's about a 2-hour flight. They're so much more progressive than us. They've actually looked at ways to fund equitably. They factor in other things. They factor in like community poverty in the area, whether a school is in a rural area or in an urban area. So they weight the way they fund schools in a much more holistic way, and it's not based on per pupil spending, but it's really based on what that community needs in order to provide the most balanced and comprehensive education for their students. We have a long way to go to get to that, but I would hope that we could move in that direction.
Yeah, I do agree. It's a matter of metrics and indicators, and how we're slowly moving towards those being developed and more around equity. And we're just talking about this national organization, Policy Link, that is hosting this week in Chicago a convention. So I think a lot of governments, hopefully the city of Chicago, starts embracing more of those indicators beyond the narrow scope of the problem. Again, I would like to see indicators that fund schools around life expectancy. Like, where do we need to do the most investment? Because other aspects of residents' lives are being affected, such as their lifespan. They say now your zip code determines your life expectancy more than your many other indicators. So.
This is a quick question that maybe I should have covered in my intro. What are the main reasons that a school is closed? And that is actually a really good question because it's super complicated and it always changes. So Kate, would you mind just running down some of the reasons why CPS has closed schools in the past?
Yes. So in the past, it was largely performance-driven. So academic performance of the school was one of the primary driving forces for selecting schools. That, just to take it way back, that was kind of an aftermath effect of No Child Left Behind. So No Child Left Behind required that school districts adopt accountability standards, and one of the sanctions that could come if you were not performing or making adequate yearly progress is that you could be closed. Then we transitioned in 2013, utilization was used to determine who closed. So utilization within, it's a CPS concept, but it's also generally, when you look nationwide, academic performance or school utilization are usually the two primary factors that people are looking at. Utilization is very much what it sounds like. So how many students are in your school? Do you have the optimum number of students? In CPS, they would take your ideal class size, multiply it out by the number of classrooms that you have. Also, there were constraining factors, just to make it more complicated. So CPS in 2013 said your utilization, you would be underutilized, but they said they wouldn't close a level 1 school, which is a performance metric. So I mentioned that just for the point that sometimes it's just utilization, sometimes it's just academics, sometimes it's a hybrid, which makes it always a fun thing to keep track of. But again, utilization and academic performance are pretty consistent trends nationwide.
And I think this one is for Paola. What are some good ways to repurpose the empty school buildings?
That's a great question. I have to say, schools design, it's very flexible. It's a great layout because they're already compartmentalized, but they also have already common spaces. So that's why residential developers look after these buildings immediately, especially the historic ones, because it's a layout that is really easy. Well, not easy, but it's more feasible to transform. The building, Overton, that we were looking at before, that's going to be offices. In the middle of a neighborhood, it's very strategic. And in this case, it's going to be incubation space for businesses, local businesses. So the idea of classrooms, imagine a classroom becoming a space to work, a space to learn. That layout and that distribution of spaces, organization of spaces offers a lot of flexibility for repurposing. What I would also say is that there's a lot of outdoor spaces that the school's grounds have. That's why the project is called Creative Grounds. If it's not school grounds, well, could be something else. But there's a lot of open space area that can also become part of the public life, the neighborhood life of their community. So there's a lot of real estate to work with, which I think it's really interesting, the scale that offers to think about repurposing.
And so this kind of goes beyond the effects of school closures on the kids that were inside the buildings, but what are some of the harmful effects of when you do close a school down to the community that lives around that school? What are some of the things that we know happens after school closures?
I can mention one very straightforward: real estate value on home properties. You know, a school is an asset. It's a real estate asset. And some of the, from the urban planning perspective, like once you lose an asset of that nature, obviously home prices, land value decreases. It gets impacted, affected. Just the same way we think in reverse, like we have a great store, or a great building, a museum, a facility that increases our property prices. It does the opposite effect. So I would say that, and obviously everything that entails the decrease of property values.
I think in some communities they've seen a spike potentially in violence or in crime because the schools are empty, and there's also young people that are forced to go to other neighborhoods, and so if there's gang territories or those kinds of issues around safety, that becomes more of an issue. And I think it also it goes along with the real estate values, but it kind of signals a decline and a disinvestment, and so that could have a real impact in new business coming in. I would say that there's a caveat to that, or an exception in some communities that are on the verge of gentrifying. If you empty out the school, it might be faster to do the gentrifying, right? So that's also something that has been seen in some other cities, and potentially in Chicago it might be starting to happen. So it can have that effect as well. And then there's research on neighborhood cohesion and neighborhood identity, and when you close schools, you really get at the fabric of that community. So it starts to impact how that community identity and the cohesiveness, the neighbors, see each other or participate in things because you have these empty institutions.
The only only thing I have to add is just I think it's an interesting and exciting kind of front of research is that we are seeing more research that's looking across subject areas at this issue. So there was a law review article that kind of analyzed the overlap of public housing and school closures. There was a UIC report that came out in 2016 called Why These Schools that looked at housing patterns, school closings, and charter expansion. So the more that we start to look at the issue from all different angles, I think the better understanding that we have of the impact.
I think we have time for maybe like one more question. My timekeeper. We have time for 2 more questions? Okay, great. Do you have any suggestions for how to engage people who do not have a direct stake in CPS? So that would be people who maybe don't live in Chicago, people who are single without children. I guess, how do we get those folks to care about what's going on in our public school system and get them involved?
I'll jump in. On a really just basic level, if we want our city to function, we have to educate our citizens. So when we give up on the students who attend our neighborhood high schools, and it's about 40% of CPS public high school students go to these neighborhood high schools. And neighborhood high schools are the schools that are the most open and accessible. They'll basically take anyone who walks through their doors. Some are really high functioning, a lot are kind of in the middle, and some are struggling, and they're struggling with enrollment and with performance. But if we give up on those schools in particular, then you're sort of contributing to another generation of young people who might not go to college, who might have a hard time getting a job, who won't become taxpayers, who won't be prepared to work in everything that we have in Chicago. So I think at that level of just the vitality of our city, we should be doing everything possible to make sure that our public high school students are getting the best education they can.
Kind of the same reason I tell people I like working in education law. It's more proactive than it is reactive. Giving students a quality education, giving every student access to a quality education, you're proactively improving life outcomes beyond measure.
I was just telling Kalyn this morning that that this morning I came from this event. It's kind of unrelated, but it is related. Again, my world is architecture. And from architecture, we don't think often how can we have agency in items that are about equity, social equity especially. And there's a big event internationally called the Venice Biennale that happens obviously every 2 years. But the U.S. gets, or every country in the world gets a pavilion to be represented. And the U.S. Pavilion this year is represented. It's actually hosted by University of Chicago, a partnership between University of Chicago and the School of the Art Institute where I teach. And they chose this topic about dimensions of citizenship to drive the conversation about what the U.S. has to say in terms of design, but also it brings attention to what role each one of us have, regardless of our discipline, profession, area of expertise, to engage in matters of the city. So I would say embrace your whatever level of citizenship you want and talk to others about it. I didn't know, and the moment I knew about the school closures, it just became part of my daily agenda. So I talked to my students, I talked to my colleagues, I talked to my friends. I'm not a writer, but I co-wrote a piece with Kalyn to talk about in the circles of architecture, where I think I have the most influence. So don't discard any tools that you have available to make this an issue of all of us. It's not one agency, it's not one person, it's not one community. It's an issue that we all have to embrace together.
And this is the last question, got in right under the gun here. Considering the rising cost of housing, can we anticipate more school closings, consolidations, and more charter schools? And I think what the question is trying to get out here is kind of the connection that we see between housing and schools. And so if each of you could maybe speak a little bit to how you see those two things interacting in our city. And certainly we do know that the cost of housing can push people out of the city. So I think that's what this is getting at.
Sure. So I think we have kind of two very opposite examples of how this can go. So the example I mentioned earlier with Ogden Jenner, that is a neighborhood or a community that includes people of varying income status, and Cabrini will be redeveloping. And there was an equitable approach taken there. There were two cool communities that came together, and that was, it legally is a consolidation, but that was one solution that people were able to work through together. And again, it took a long time to get there. Also, I wanted to mention earlier, I was at a community meeting for Ogden Jenner, and I will never forget, one of the women sitting in front of me had asked a question about the transition planning. So this was 2 years in, and she just felt like it wasn't enough. Like it wasn't clear enough, it wasn't specific enough. And I'm sure her concerns were valid, but all I could think about in that moment was there were people in 2013 who had 2 months notice. So, you know, the decision was technically made in May, their schools closed in June. How did those people feel? How did those parents and students feel? So again, and not saying everyone's feelings, I mean, they're your feelings, but it just I felt like it really showed how things can be done differently in different areas. So at one edge of the city, you've got Jenner Ogden, you move to the near south community, and you have what's happening with NTA and South Loop, which is not an equitable approach. Basically, they're turning a school, they're phasing out a school to make a high school. So I think time will tell with where we're headed. Obviously, the moratorium technically ended this year, and we did have a lot of things on the docket to consider as far as school actions. I don't know with any degree of certainty what we'll see in the future, but I think those areas where housing and, also in near south, the Ickes homes will be redeveloping, which makes it another direct comparator. I think those areas are really places that we could see a lot of either really great things or really not great things happening.
I think we've seen a decrease in population in some communities, and it's mostly in Black, low-income communities. I mean, that's the reality in our city. People have moved, they've left the city, they've gone to the collar counties, or maybe they've gone to other states. And in those communities, if we continue to see a decline in population, is it okay to close their schools? I would say no. Like, what kind of city do we want to be? We need to educate our communities. We need to have schools available for students. So even though, let's say, property values are not going up in those communities, but people are leaving for various reasons, we still have a responsibility to have high-functioning schools. In some communities where there is more gentrification going on, or higher income families like we saw in the South Loop demanding a neighborhood high school. There's talk of the West Loop community growing, and they want their own neighborhood high school. We see, again, like the Northwest side with Taft High School. What's interesting there is that property values are going up, there are higher income families in those communities, and guess what? They're kind of tired of school choice. Their kids are not getting into Walter Payton and Northside. They're not so sure about the charter schools. There are fewer and fewer Catholic schools. The private schools, independent schools are very expensive. So now those families are saying, we want an open enrollment neighborhood high school, and we're going to make sure that it's a good school. And CPS is kind of following along and providing that, but at the cost of other things and without genuine public engagement. I don't know how many of you saw the diet hunger strike a few years ago. That community was asking to have a neighborhood high school because by closing diet, they were no longer going to have an open enrollment neighborhood high school nearby. But guess what? They had to go on a hunger strike, and they were mostly Black and they were mostly low income. So we really have to be aware of the race and class politics in the city as we see these things happen. It's going to be different in different neighborhoods. But I can imagine that there will be opportunities or reasonings for why to close another round of schools. I would hope that we have more meaningful public engagement and that people who are impacted have a say in helping to shape those solutions, which could be very innovative. It could be like what we just saw in the video, before closing a school, turning it into a really thriving neighborhood asset. And the decision shouldn't be made solely on enrollment numbers or solely on performance. They should really be about what that community needs to thrive.
I would just add to that, again, it goes back to innovative policies and what other policies are in place that support funding. Resources are limited, of course, but again, the city can be very innovative when it comes to certain developments. So for instance, housing that is directly correlated to functioning of and openings of and closings of schools. Housing developments have an affordable requirement ordinance in place that allows the city to, that requires developers to dedicate a certain percentage of the units that they're developing into affordable units. If they're not allowed to provide those units in place, the money that would be dedicated to develop those goes to a pool. So, that's a high-level understanding of that policy. But similar considerations around that policy should be made around schools. Like the public monies we see them separated by agencies, but they're very innovative ways in which resources can be combined and strategically invested. So again, it's all about looking not only at the specific problem of schools, but how the different amenities and social infrastructure assets that the city can provide can be used in a much more innovative and efficient way.
Well, thank you all so much. I think this was the end of the questions, but thank you all for coming and for listening to what we had to say.